I am deeply honored to introduce two great scholars working on one of the endangered East Asian languages, Jejueo, Professor William O'Grady and Dr. Sejung Yang. They will be co-presenting the talk, and we will have a 15-minute long Q&A session after the presenters' talks are finished. Let me briefly introduce two scholars. Professor William O'Grady is a professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. He has long been committed to the revitalization of Jejueo, the critically endangered language still spoken by elderly residents of Korea's Jeju Island. In addition to co-authoring a book on the language with Dr. Sejung Yang, he has written a number of articles on strategies that are most likely to help maintain and restore the intergenerational transmission of endangered languages. More recently, he has begun to investigate the non-linguistic factors that contribute to the decline of languages, ranging from the oppressive policies of national governments to the prejudices of powerful individuals. Dr. Sejung Yang is a language activist and linguist in the Jejueo community in Jeju Island, South Korea. She earned her PhD in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Her dissertation compared the Jejueo and English language abilities of Jeju residents in different age groups. Currently, she works for the Institute for Humanities at Jeju National University. Her research interests include endangered language education, language revitalization, cultural revival, cultural and linguistic identity, language policies and planning, endangered language orthography, and the integration of language documentation with pedagogical material development. The title of their talk is Language Revitalization Opportunities and Challenges in East Asia and Beyond. As a proud Jeju guy, I can't wait to listen to the talk. So from now on, I'm going to hand the stage over to them. So please welcome Professor Luke O'Grady.
Well, I'd like to begin, of course, by thanking George Shi for inviting me to this event. So many bright and concerned people. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to learn more from each other and hopefully strengthen our strategies going forward. I'm going to focus today on what I call hidden dangers on the road to revitalization. Here's a map from the UH Endangered Language Project that depicts the situation in Asia and the Americas. You can see hundreds of red, yellow, and green dots there, each marking a language that's endangered to a documented degree. Orange and red dots are for critically endangered, green is for at risk. Both 35 years ago, linguists began to issue warnings about an accelerated loss of languages around the world. And the great sociologist of language, Joshua Fishman, was one of the very first to sound the alarm. He said, the world is full of languages that have fewer and fewer users every generation. Another linguist, Michael Krauss, made a particularly pessimistic prediction that had a major impact on the field of linguistics. The forecast, in fact, changed modern linguistics. Krauss predicted that the 21st century would see either the death or doom of 90% of the world's languages. We're now already almost a quarter of the way through that 21st century. There have been a lot of attempts to slow down the loss of languages, even to reverse language loss, but success has not been easy to achieve. We've developed programs, as Anne Goodfellow notes, she's an anthropologist, we've developed programs in an attempt to revitalize languages that are no longer being learned as a mother tongue. In most cases, though, these programs are failing to produce fluent speakers, and more people are recognizing that. So the big question now becomes, can languages be saved. Well, the road to success is a steep and narrow path, no doubt about that. I think we need to start with the root of the problem and work from there. The very first sign of language endangerment is inevitably a low rate of intergenerational transmission. Put simply, children fail to fully acquire the language of their parents. So the only way to save languages, obviously, is to identify and exploit the conditions under which language is acquired and maintained. That's what intergenerational transmission means. It means language acquisition. That's what it comes down to. And there are essentially the two ideas about how to proceed. The first idea is that the job of saving a language, the job of saving a language belongs to the family. That was, in fact, Joshua Fishman's idea. As he put it, a threatened language must first be acquired at home before children even arrive at school. He said, all the school can do is maintain the endangered language as a second language for another generation. It won't put the language back in the home where it belongs. The other well-known strategy is to go about saving languages by relying on the schools. And at first glance, that seems to make sense because what are schools for? They're for teaching things, right? And schools do try to teach languages as well. And a lot of people believe that that's the institution to which we should look if we want to save our languages. Well, the best case scenario, obviously, would be a combination of the two strategies, right? The children would hear their heritage language at home, and they'd go to school and they'd be exposed to it there as well. But that's not the way it's unfolding. In a 2017 survey that the University of Hawaii did in conjunction with the Smithsonian Institution, we found something quite different. Of the 30 revitalization programs that were studied on 5 different continents, there was just one program that was committed to saving language at home. It looks like the school-based strategy is the path that revitalization movements around the world have chosen. And we need to move forward with that in mind, at least for the purpose of today's talk. Now, as you probably know, the gold standard for school-based revitalization is the so-called language immersion program. In fact, that's the goal of many language revitalization initiatives. People want to get to the point, the communities want to get to the point where their heritage language is being used in the school. But there are a number of factors that are going to determine the success or failure of that plan. And I'd like to spend most of my talk today discussing those factors with you. The first factor involves exposure to the language. The single most important factor contributing to language development is what we call input, the amount of exposure that children get to the language. Children don't acquire a language without being exposed to it. In fact, without having ample exposure to it. But there's a complication. And that is that language revitalization requires a commitment to bilingualism. There are no language revitalization programs that I know of that seek to abandon the dominant language in the community and use only the traditional endangered language. Heritage language. There's always bilingualism involved, and that means there has to be input from two often very different languages. Well, question, how much input is enough for both languages to be learned? And how are you going to cut up the input? The children are still only awake the same number of hours every day, right? Well, it turns out that children who receive less than a quarter of their input from the endangered language, the minor language, are going to fall short of fluency. If you're exposed, less than 1/4 of your input comes from minor language, you're going to fall short of fluency. The recommendation from a variety of scholars in the field of bilingualism is a ratio of no worse than 30-70. In other words, 30%. You want 30% of your input to come from the heritage language that you're trying to preserve. That's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. There's an arithmetic that evolves from that. Let's take a school-based immersion program. Let's assume a 14-hour day, 7 days a week. That gives us a 100-hour week. Actually, it's 98 hours, but let's call it 100, make it easy to do the math. Let's assume a 5-hour school day, 5 days a week. That gives us a 25-hour school week. Assuming that the child gets the heritage language all day in school, those 5 hours a day, then what you end up with is a ratio of school time to non-school time of about 25 to 75. That's a precarious ratio. It's a little less than the recommended 30-70 borderline ratio that I mentioned a minute ago. And guess what? I'm not putting in vacation time. Right? I'm assuming 52 weeks of the year, the child is in the immersion programs. So listen, immersion programs may well be our best hope, but even they are teetering on the edge of failure. With me? Not happily, but right. So listen, the most successful immersion programs right now are acknowledging that need for at least some explicit language training in school. It used to be thought that all you have to do is put the child in the classroom, expose them to the language for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they fully acquire the language. People don't believe that anymore. They realize that you're going to have to supplement what they're learning in school with some explicit instruction in order for them to acquire all the details of morphology, grammar, and vocabulary. Moreover, there's a need for opportunities to use the language outside of school. You got to give the children a chance to learn something other than school talk. School talk is not kid talk. There's another factor now that I want to address. I'll call it the word frequency effect. There are two measures that we use for evaluating the richness of language input. One involves quantity, the number of words that children hear. The other involves quality, the number of different words that they hear. I'm going to illustrate that with the example you see there, the bottom of the screen. The stars in the sky guided the boy in the boat. There's 11 words in that sentence, right? But only 7 different words. That's how we distinguish between quantity and quality. Well, my colleagues and I decided to investigate language use by teachers in 3 very different immersion programs with the goal of seeing how many words children were being exposed to and how many of those vocabulary items were distinct, unique. Well, the first program was in Guatemala for the language Kaqchikel, so that Mayan language. Another one of the programs we investigated was Western Subanon in the Philippines, and the third was Maori, Polynesian language of New Zealand. And the quantity factor was quite reassuring. It turns out that the average number of words that children hear in the course of an hour in school, quite comparable to the number of words they would hear in an hour in a home setting in a monolingual environment. So for Kaqchikel, it was about 942 words per hour they were hearing. For Western Subanon and Maori, it was even higher, 1,600, 1,700 words an hour. That's robust. If you were looking at a monolingual home environment for English, you'd see that the range of words heard per hour is somewhere between 620 and 2,600, depending in large part on the talkativeness of family members, to put it simply and accurately. And the more they talk, the quicker the children learn the language, by the way. But matters become more complicated and worrisome when we do the calculations for the number of different words that children hear an hour. here we have to take into account something called Zipf's law. And this is named after the linguist and statistician, George Zipf. And basically what the law says is relatively few words are used frequently. Most words occur rarely, with many occurring only once in even large samples of text. So this is what the graph looks like. You see there's a very small number of words that are used very frequently and a much larger number of words that are used very, very infrequently. And the most frequent words in English are the, and, to, in, is, you, are, for, and that. Now try to build a sentence out of those words. Not easy, right? But those are the words you hear most frequently. Here's what happens when we look at those three programs. We see all three programs having basically the same frequency distribution, with a small number of words being used very frequently and a large number of words being used infrequently. And here's your consequence. A table. Focus on the center columns there, the ones in yellow. Approximately half of what the teachers said during those 5 hours a day consisted of the same 50 words. And 3/4 of all the words they said consisted of the same 100 words. It's not easy under those circumstances to build a vocabulary. And what you want is you want a 6-year-old child, an 8-year-old child to have a 6,000 word vocabulary. It's not easy to do that if you don't get exposed to the words. And the same for grammatical patterns, by the way. The most frequent grammatical patterns, there's a small number of very frequent grammatical patterns and a very large number of infrequent grammatical patterns to which the child is rarely exposed, but needs to acquire in order to become fluent in the language. These things matter because comfortable speech requires easy access to appropriate vocabulary and grammatical patterns. If you have limited proficiency, you're going to use the language infrequently because you're not comfortable using it. And if you use it infrequently, guess what's going to happen? You're going to become less proficient. Right? The cycle of doom. Can these problems be fixed? Well, there's going to have to be some changes in what happens in the school, right? There's going to have to be a flattening of the curve so that words that are otherwise low frequency words are used more often. And you're going to have more input inside school and outside school. And you're going to have regular assessments to make sure that the teachers are in fact doing their part of the bargain and that the children are in fact being positively impacted by the input that they're getting from the teachers. And this brings me to the third and final factor, which is involves a sobering fact, which is that it's children who ultimately determine a family's language policy. As Steve Pinker says, friends are more important than parents when it comes to maintaining a language. And that sentiment's been expressed by other people, specialists in the field of bilingualism research, like Barbara Pearson. She said, the natural attraction of the majority language for the child is very important. Colin Baker, author, number of books on bilingualism. The majority language is perceived by even young children as having higher status, being more prestigious, and having more uses and purposes. I could give you other quotes as well. But I want to conclude with a very sobering lesson involving a 7-year-old child who came with a former student of mine to Hawaii for a 10-month stay, student with her mom. And the idea was she would be immersed in an English language environment and her mom would even speak to her in English. So the child was 6 years, 10 months when she arrived. And we immediately tested her knowledge of Korean and her knowledge of English. She, here's what the results looked like. On day one, she came into my office. We tested her 100% correct on 120 vocabulary items in Korean. 0% on those 120 vocabulary items in English. 2 months later, 50% of the Korean vocabulary was gone. A few more weeks, she was unable to speak Korean to her father, who had remained in Korea. 8 months later, 70% of the vocabulary was lost, and so was the language. She spoke only English from that time on. That's how quickly it can happen. What can you do to help? Well, help a child. The more language is used at home, the faster and better children will learn it. The more the children speak it themselves, the better their language skills will become. The more interaction with different speakers of the heritage language, better. Continued parental use of the heritage language at home is especially important when children go off to school. Use of the dominant language at home can have a negative impact. And of course, the community needs to promote pride in their language and in their heritage because it's the status of the language that the children notice. You can lie to them about Santa Claus, but you can't lie to them about the status of the language. They pick it up. Okay? They notice it. Okay, my comments have been of a general nature, outlining challenges that are likely to arise in any language revitalization program anywhere. And we need to think hard about these things. I'm going to pass the baton now to Sejung, the leading language activist in the country. She's going to talk to us about Jejueo, her heritage language, which she's devoted a great deal of effort and energy over the last 10 years. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Sejung. In part two, the focus is Jejueo education. In particular, I will outline the current state of Jejueo education regarding the amount of exposure to Jejueo in the school system, language policy, and funding for Jejueo education in comparison to English education. This presentation, however, is limited in terms of suggesting the best solutions for the current situation in Jeju. Nonetheless, at the end of this presentation, I will mention multilingualism as a potential avenue for fostering a more inclusive educational environment for Jejueo. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly address three main points in relation to what William said. First, with regard to the importance of exposure to the heritage language, I'm sad to say that our community offers relatively little opportunity for young children to learn Jejueo. As I will explain in more detail later, the 70-30 ratio suggested by William and other scholars does not come close to being reached in Jeju. Second, the word frequency effect. With regard to the need for careful curation of teaching materials to ensure that children encounter a rich and diverse set of vocabulary items and grammatical patterns, no attention is paid to these standards in the materials available for language learners in Jeju. The environment. With regard to the importance of the status of the heritage language, Jejueo has long been treated as a substandard dialect of Korean and is considered to be unsuitable for use as a language of education. As a result, many members of the community avoid its use in public and are reluctant to encourage its use by their children. Keeping these 3 points in mind, let me take you to Jeju Island. Here is a map showing the location of Jeju Island, the largest island in South Korea. The lines connect to various countries in Asia where small language communities exist, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan. Jejueo is the language spoken at Jeju Island, and there is a diaspora community in Osaka, Japan, where Jejueo is also spoken. Jejueo was declared a critically endangered language in 2010. Now, let's delve into the details in terms of exposure to Jejueo. Although we don't have direct data from the classroom similar to Maori and Western Subanon, we can easily find information from official documents provided by 2 local agencies, the Jeju Special Self-Governing Provincial Government and the Jeju Special Self-Governing Provincial Office of Education. As the name suggests, Jeju local government has a high level of autonomous authority. They can directly influence the education system if they wish, compared to other regions in Korea. So acknowledging the high level of Jeju's autonomy, we should ask how many hours of Jejueo is going to be taught officially in the 2024 academic year. In part one, William highlighted the importance of extensive and varied input for the acquisition of endangered languages. Therefore, do students in Jeju get enough input to use the language? The answer is that young learners receive 4 to 5 hours of Jejueo instruction depending on schools per year. And if you do the math, it comes down to 7.5 minutes for elementary school kids and 9.4 minutes for middle and high school students per week. It's worse than Taiwanese case. This is so little compared to the amount of input mentioned in part one. It's almost nothing in terms of acquisition. Then what about the only university in Jeju? Does Jeju National University offer any Jeju programs? The answer is no. But they are teaching German, Japanese, Chinese, and English in their own departments. Also, it's mandatory to take 2 English courses and achieve a certain level of English proficiency to graduate. And not to mention that to get into the university, you have to pass the English exam. Moreover, there are 2 departments specifically designated to produce English teachers. Here, I'd like to remind you that Jeju had the authority to shape education programs. But JNU has all the programs that can be found anywhere else in Korea, and nothing reflects regional specialties. Then within such limited instructional hours in schools, how will Jejueo be taught? There are 3 options. The first option is to teach Jejueo in extracurricular classes or incorporate it into regular classes if applicable. So for example, teachers could introduce songs in Jejueo during music classes. And the third option is to request Jejueo teachers from the Jejueo Preservation Society, which is a private organization. As you can see, Jejueo is not being taught as a subject, and it is being introduced mainly as an extra or additional topic in the regular curriculum or extracurricular classes. Although Jejueo is not being taught as a subject yet, Jeju has begun producing teaching materials and textbooks. For example, the Jeju Office of Education offers some free downloadable teaching materials and textbooks that are quite well organized, colorful, and interesting for young learners. Here is a copy of one section with a QR code that leads you to the site where you can listen to a weather forecast in Jejueo. Also, a list of animations about Jeju culture and stories have been created and can be watched on YouTube with either Korean or English subtitles. I have to admit that it is quite huge improvement compared to 2018 when I was writing my own dissertation. However, there are no studies done to evaluate those instructional materials in terms of the quality and quantity of vocabulary items and grammatical patterns. Now, in this section, I'd like to talk about language policy and the budget assigned for Jejueo education to give you a better understanding of what is going on in Jejueo education. In Jeju, Jejueo education was initiated based on the support of 2 main legal frameworks. The first one is known as the Ordinance for the Conservation and Promotion of Jejueo, which was formulated in 2007. It was established even before UNESCO announced Jejueo as an endangered language in 2010. And then in 2015, the Ordinance for the Revitalization of Jejueo education was formulated. Therefore, based on these 2 critical legal frameworks, Jejueo was able to be taught in school system. As you can see, the second ordinance is solely devoted to Jejueo education. Therefore, I'd like to briefly introduce this ordinance to you. According to the ordinance, the goal is to activate Jejueo education so that students can develop fostering pride in Jejueo. So as you can see, the keywords are Jejueo education, students, culture, and pride in Jejueo. The ordinance also outlines the definitions of Jejueo and Jejueo education. First, Jejueo is defined as the traditional language spoken in Jeju, representing the cultural identity of the region. Second, Jejueo education is defined as the education that uses Jejueo either as educational content or integrated it into the educational curriculum. The ordinance also includes more detailed plans as follows: creating the environment for Jejueo education, securing resources, developing and researching, increasing student participation, and expanding Jejueo training for educators. I personally believe that this legal document is fascinating. It actually includes almost everything Jejueo requires to be revitalized. But the why Jejueo is still being endangered when there is such a perfect education policy designated only for Jejueo, and why Jejueo is still being taught only for 7 minutes per week. There is a well-known saying in English, education is the key to success, but it's also expensive. So we should examine the funding allocated for Jejueo. Is Jejueo receiving sufficient funding? Given that there is an education policy specifically for Jejueo, one might expect a significant amount of funding to be directed toward Jejueo education. Before revealing the amount of funding for Jejueo, here are some basic education statistics in Jeju. There are a total of 189 schools with 79,000 students. Also, we need to ask about the total funding for Jejueo revitalization and preservation allocated by the Jeju local government. The answer is 12 million US dollars. This is quite a lot. This amount is for 5 years between 2023 and 2027. For your understanding, the Jeju local government establishes a master plan for the development of Jejueo every 5 years and announces a corresponding budget proposal. Last year, the first master plan was established. I now have some interesting questions for you. If you are responsible for language revitalization efforts, how would you allocate this budget? While there are several possible strategies, how much funding would you allocate precisely to education? Oops. The note stopped here somehow.
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
I understand the situation. Instead of putting more money, just try to develop innovative curriculum. That is more important. Because in the Los Angeles Unified School District, they offer two-way immersion program. Okay, and they offer all the content courses taught in English. Okay, and the following day they focus on English only program. So for them, not just money is not the issue, but the curriculum design and the status of the target language.
Right.
In Los Angeles, Korean is a heritage language. It's considered a minority language among the immigrant children. However, they go to, let's say, a two-way immersion program offered the Canadian like French, and they are very eager to go to French immersion program. So in the case of LAUSD, they made a huge success, not only content courses, but also the acquisition of Korea. So I believe it's not really a matter of how much money you bet make the best.
Exactly. So
But
in
the
order to
state-
create the curriculum,
Yeah,
probably need
the
money, right?
status of the language and the curriculum design,
Right.
and also the frequency is also very important. Yeah, right. The curriculum design, content-based instruction is best well known among this kind of immersion program. So if we have a chance to stay LA one more week,
Oh, yeah.
can you contact LAUSD, and they have a really excellent curriculum.
Ooh, that sounds great.
Okay.
Yes.
I will let you know the address. The
Oh,
contact
are you
person.
taking me to that?
I will give you contact.
That might be difficult for me to travel by myself.
Don't worry. I will protect you, but I know the contact person in charge of LAUSD way immersion program and the secret behind their success.
Oh, this is the old one. Oh, but this, oh, wait, no, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just sorry about that. This. So where we are waiting? Oh, okay.
You will take something.
So the total funding for Jeju revitalization and conservation is 12 million US dollars once again. And the question is, how would you like to allocate the budget precisely to education? So in the case of Jeju, 3 million, well, actually, the exchange rate is really high these days. So it comes down to 3 million US dollars, okay, for 5 years. And then it's less than actually $600,000 per year. So Jeju is using that amount of money only for Jeju education. But a lot of the budget also goes to other things other than education. For example, improving Jejueo policies, researching and archiving, and promoting awareness of Jejueo, including the establishment of Jejueo Museum. So far there, however, so far there has been no public discussion or research done or evaluation of initiatives in relation to these areas, and not to mention the Jejueo education. So going back to Jejueo education, the funding for each school is less than 5,000 US dollars, and it includes the basic budget for operating Jejueo programs and Jejueo clubs. Then is this funding typical for language education in Korea? In order to find out whether this is common or not, we can compare this with the budget allocated for English education. In 2024, the Jeju Office of Education is operating 31 supplementary English programs. And the first one is the same as Jejueo. So for operating English clubs, each school receives 600 US dollars per year. Then operating listening programs, each school receives more than 9,000 US dollars. And I will just stop here because you can imagine that if I continue, the amount will just go up, right? So with a total of 31 English programs, over $9,000 is allocated for operating just two programs, whereas Jejueo support is only about $4,000 in total. Despite the substantial difference in budget allocation between English and Jejueo, there has been no discussion or comparison of these two figures. Is it simply taken for granted? We believe that many people would not consider this as a given and that it's worth further discussing this imbalance. Let me briefly talk about English education. English is taught from the 3rd grade in elementary schools as a foreign language subject. As can be seen, while Jejueo is taught for less than 10 minutes per week, 1 to 2 hours a week. Of 2 hours per week won't make anyone proficient in English. but it gives you an idea of the difference in the amount of input provided in the school system. Then, given the substantial investment in English education, one may question whether Jeju students they perform better in English more than in Jejueo, right? So, what do you think? The answer is simply yes. While various factors may influence language knowledge, the results of tests conducted on English and Jejueo reveal that among middle school students, English proficiency was significantly higher than that of Jejueo. In a simple vocabulary test, Jeju middle school students were able to say the words tree, flower, and rainbow in English. However, the accuracy rate for Jejueo was only 14%. The same phenomena was found in the assessment of sentence production test. The same middle school participants were more able to produce Minho is eating an apple in English than in Jejueo, Minho 능금 먹었죠. Despite having the explicit language policy for over a decade, Jejueo education is moving very slowly. It seems that the policy has not been implemented effectively at all. In particular, there is not enough funding for stable Jejueo education, which is evident when a comparison is made to English education. In addition, in early 2024, this year, there was a shocking news. 4 elementary schools in Jeju introduced the English immersion programs for first grade students teaching all subjects in English except the Korean language module. In this new change, one can easily predict that the proficiency disparity between English and Jejueo will just further widen. Because young children will get enough exposure to English satisfying the 70-30 ratio needed for English education. Furthermore, we have to discuss various kinds of long-term effects on the Jeju community as soon as possible due to this new development. So far, I've introduced the current state of Jeju education. Now, I'd like to talk about what can help improve this situation. According to Colin Baker, who is a bilingualism expert, if a minority language is not used in educational settings, its long-term survival prospects in modern society may be significantly reduced. Allow me to briefly delve into Jeju's past. In reality, both Jejueo and its speakers were subjected to harsh treatment in the school system. Here is a picture of a school teacher protesting in front of the Jeju Office of Education building in 2011. He said that our generation couldn't use Jejueo not only during class, but also in conversations between teachers and students at school. If we used Jejueo, we would face criticism as being old-fashioned and rude, and sometimes even be physically punished. I've also heard people mention that during the 70s and 80s, Jejueo responses were considered incorrect even when they accurately matched the pictures. Therefore, it's evident that centralized education plays a significant role in the current endangerment and stigmatization of Jejueo and its speakers. But now, one day, due to the young children growing up in English immersion schools, only English answers might be taken as correct. In recent years, there has been a huge effort to break the stigmatization and revitalize Jejueo. However, when we compare this effort with English education, we can see that it is still not enough. According to Galler, minority language groups undergo specific stages in promoting their language in education. So for example, in stage 1, a minority language is taught in extracurricular classes, and then it goes through stages of being taught as an optional subject and as a regular subject, and then moving on to the stages where it is used as the medium of instruction. Jejueo education is currently in the initial stage after many, many years, where the language is taught in extracurricular classes. In contrast, languages like Maori, Hawaiian, Kaqchikel, and Western Subalon mentioned earlier in part one, and some other European languages have advanced to the final stage, establishing emergent education. In addition, English has reached that final stage in Jeju as well. Can Jeju education progress to the next stage? If so, when might that occur? And what changes are necessary? And who is responsible? Is simply allocating more funds to education sufficient? There are numerous potential changes to consider. However, we would like to propose one actionable step that hasn't been widely proposed in Jeju, that is adopting multilingualism. Korea's central government has been pursuing monolingualism, utilizing Korean as the medium of education. However, in Jeju, Jejueo, English, and Korean are in competition with each other, and each language is important for different reasons and supported by legal frameworks and people in Jeju. However, now is the time to use our provincial autonomy to discuss balanced multilingualism. While transitioning to multilingualism, instead of regarding each language in isolation, these three languages should be discussed collectively because individuals use them interactively rather than separately. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Grady and Dr. Yang, for the great talk. Now our Q&A session, so please feel free to raise your questions. Oh, please.
Professor, he mentions that to revitalize a language, the language has to be acquired at home, right?
No, I didn't quite say that. That was the recommendation of Joshua Fishman. Right. I didn't endorse it specifically. My view is that a combination of the two would probably be best. Yeah.
Sure. Because I observed from Professor Young's talk that it seems that in Jeju, in the family, the parents also start to passing on the language to the children.
Right.
Yeah, and so even if we face a kind of conflict, like even in Taiwan, some parents try to proceed to passing on the language, but when their children go to school, they go into a whole Mandarin environment. And they've been influenced by the peers so much that they go home and say, I'm not going to speak in Taiwanese anymore. Outside our house, there's no one speaking Taiwanese. Don't speak Taiwanese to me anymore. So
Yeah.
there's a kind of terrible pressure. I mean, out of the family. So it's always.
Actually, there was one more question from back. Yeah.
I have a clarifying question. When Jeju launched the English Immersion program this year, how were the teachers recruited? Are they Korean, like teachers who are proficient in English instruction?
So they're co-teachers. So they hired native English speakers. And then they also have Korean teachers present on the class foreign teachers. Foreign teacher and Korean teacher together.
So the online people can see.
Oh, all right. Oh.
Mike.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, so Jeju Office of Education, they spend a lot of money for hiring native English speakers. And now they're using those students, those teachers as teachers in those kinds of English immersion programs. Yes, very similar to what happens in Taiwan and other countries, I guess.
Sir. Yes.
Yeah, this sort of follow up with Sejung's question, and this issue about kids talking to parents in the new language is a widespread phenomenon it's a universal, not only in an endangered situation, in our environment, but, my colleague Ajahn Jenjit and I did a survey on the heritage Thai speakers in Los Angeles. And we asked, young Thai students, what language do you speak? And they say, we speak English to our parents. And parents always speak to the kids in Thai. And so this imbalance communication happens all the time. And there's I don't know, maybe some of you know the answer, but I haven't seen any proposal how to reverse, how to change this pattern of unbalanced communication pattern. Unless we change this, we won't be able to reverse the course of, language endangerment. So that's, I think it's a universal phenomena that everybody has to worry about it. And we really, should put our thoughts together to come up with some solution, maybe not solution, but some direction where we can, we should go.
Can I comment on that? When I teach my language revitalization class in Hawaii, I mention to the students how many different disciplines and sub-disciplines have to come together, interact with each other to allow us to make sense of what's going on and how we might correct it. And the interesting thing about this particular phenomenon is that it's not really a linguistic phenomenon per se. It falls into the domain of social cognition. And what's going on is that children subconsciously, but quite naturally, preparing themselves for their own futures, which involve their peers, right? Their cohort. And that's, I think, starting point is to realize why they're doing what they're doing. And what we find is that the kids who are most likely to continue to speak the heritage language at home are the kids whose friends speak the heritage language at home, right? And the kids whose families are able to bring about a feeling of pride in the language. And the more people that the children can hear speaking the language, the better. The more opportunities they have to go back to the home country in the summertime, the better. So those sorts of obvious things. But now that we know that's a problem, we have to be on the lookout for strategies and try them. Yeah. Two questions. Well, you can answer.
Jenny, do you want to read the questions and then you can respond? Yeah, or.
Let me read it for you.
Yeah.
So there were two questions from a virtual attendee. First, are there any plans in promoting Jejueo to foreigners? And the second one is, the presentation focuses on revitalization. I wonder if Jejueo is well documented at this stage.
So regarding to the first question, are there any plans on promoting Jejueo to foreigners? Globally, but I don't think they have started. But our team with William and other professors, we have created our website in English to promote Jejueo. So people can, visit that website and they can learn about Jejueo. But we don't have much teaching materials there. So hopefully in the future we can create more materials for foreigners who want to learn Jejueo.
Here's your textbook. There's your textbook. You should mention that textbook. Jejueo textbook.
Yeah, there is a Jejueo textbook we created, but we don't have English explanations in there, right?
True.
We can add English in there as well. And then we also actually has a book of Jejueo grammar. So people who are interested in learning Jejueo grammar, they can actually read that book as well. So regarding to the second question, whether there is enough documentation in Jejueo, there are over 800 books and journal articles available at the moment. And also there has been a lot of documentation work done by the government. And there is also local government affiliated agency called Center for Jeju Studies. They put a lot of efforts into documentation. However, they don't really, I don't know whether I can say this or not, but I hope that they can actually make their recordings available to the public so that other researchers can actually use them to research more. But there hasn't been, they haven't been actually made their recordings public. So in the future, they can change their mind. Yes. So, but however, there is of course still room available for anyone who wants to document, especially using high technology. So earlier in Indonesia, people are getting trainings for documentation, right, using technology. But however, in Jeju, there hasn't been documentation using that kind of high technology, using like Elan and so on. So.
Can I have one?
Yes.
Are we out of time?
Oh, we still have time. We have
Okay, okay. There's an irony here that you need to understand. The people who are doing all this documentation work do not believe that Jejueo is a language. They believe it's a dialect, Korean, substandard dialect of Korean. Somehow they've managed to write 800 articles and books about Jejueo and still say it's Korean. So what are they? How could you write 500 or 800 books and articles if it wasn't so completely different from Korean, right? That it would have to be a separate language, which of course it is. What else? And criminal work has been done. It's 100% clear. It's not intelligible if people speak Korean. But what you have is it's fate and future in the hands of people who don't believe it's a language. Now, then you think about status of the language and the importance of status of the language for children and their parents. Who is going to encourage their children to acquire a substandard dialect, right? Korean. No good parent would do that, right? That's the type of thing that you're up against. And again, that's not a linguistic problem. That's a social and political problem. That for some reason, we have not been able to break through that wall. And how can you when the leading scholars in the field are insisting it's just a dialect? I probably shouldn't have said those things.
Your report.
Oh, yes.
I have a comment. I wouldn't believe Jeju parents would want a third language to be taught to their children that will be taking the college entrance exams. Now, in that light, I would suggest that you may push the language to be to have the status of a second foreign language, or even a first foreign language, so that the parents will not feel, oh, my kids are going to be at a disadvantage learning Jejueo instead of English or French or German or Japanese. Just
Thank you for sharing the thoughts. I think parents in Jeju, they have mixed feelings when they are asked, do we need to save the language? We need to preserve. We need to teach the language. They all say yes. Not everybody, but almost like 70 to 80% of people will say yes. I agree, because we need to save the language because we can save the culture by saving the language. But when it comes to education, in reality, maybe not so much. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we are running out of time, but I would briefly add my own comments. Because
You're the chair. You can
yeah,
do
I
it.
mean, I think the first question from the virtual attendee was very interesting, which was, are there any plans of promoting Jejueo to foreigners? I would like to share one of my experiences here at UCLA. Last year, I took introductory language class of Okinawan language, using the textbook written by Yasaki Sensei, the book he just advertised earlier today. What I was surprised about that, about taking that class, was that a lot of American students were actually interested in learning endangered East Asian languages I was expecting, honestly, I was expecting like taking, I mean, the course would have about like 4 or 5 students, but actually there were about like 20 students, and all of them were really, really passionate about learning Uchinaguchi. And I was so shocked, and I also talked about this with like Yasaki sensei and Shinzato sensei. And it also inspired me in a way like, oh, if I could have a chance to, teach Jejueo in America, maybe if the local government doesn't work at all, maybe we can increase the outer interest, right? And then force the local government to do something for the language.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, movement to maintain, Okinawa. So that's interesting. So you might want to go out to save the language inside.
Yeah, so nice. That means you should do it here.
We could start here, Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Sorry, we are. Can we have a
We're actually out of time.
Is it strike free?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite useful if foreigners have mastered the language, the indigenous language. If he's fluent enough, then that would help increase the prestige of the language. One case is that one of my students mastered Yako, and so he won the first prize in his speech contest, right? And after that, every young people started, learning the language again, by listening to their grandparents. So that would increase the prestige of the language.
Thank you so much for putting in. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for a very productive day, and thank you again to all the presenters.